Welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. This was a real privilege and a lot of fun to have my guest today, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is probably well known to most of you, but one of the most important intellectuals working today on issues around free speech, human rights, feminism, foreign policy, etc. And she's certainly no stranger to controversy and even to personal danger, not least because of her fierce criticism of Islam and Islamic culture. We go back and really dig into her own journey, personal journey from Somalia, Saudi Arabia, and then to asylum in Holland to escape from an arranged marriage, and then finally to an academic career in the US. And alongside that, her own psychological journey from a tribal mindset where she grew up to a really zealous religious conviction. I didn't know that she'd actually been burning Salman Rushdie's book during that period. But then finally to a very strongly held classical liberalism. Along the way, we talk about the limits to Islamic liberalization as well as its possibilities, the contests around free speech, critical race theory, the state of current intellectual and academic debate. She's quite pessimistic, more pessimistic than I am about some of those issues. The risks of self-censorship, where I do agree with some of her concerns. Much more along the way, we also talk about her latest book called Prey: Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. We don't agree on everything, of course, but it's really, really fascinating conversation. As I say, it was a real pleasure to have her on. As she said at the end, not agreeing is the whole point. So I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you for joining me on Dialogues.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And I'm very, very sorry that I'm late.
No problem. Actually, I heard you speak many, many years ago at the Royal Society in London with Timothy Garton Ash. And I remember it was in a very small room, and you had high security back then. I could look up what the year that it was. It was a long time ago. And it was an insight into your world. And so I just for those people who don't know your background, I think probably most people do, if you could talk just a little bit about your own journey and how that journey turned you into the kind of liberal you are now. I should say, if there's, you don't need me to say this to you, but for an American audience, the sort of liberal in a more classical European sense. But yeah, intellectually, how does your biography inform your intellectual convictions?
Yeah, and if you want to get really into the nitty-gritty of different liberals, how I am different from, my liberalism is different from that of Timothy Garton Ash. Well, I mean, I grew up, I think that bit is, people are familiar with, I was born in Somalia, I was born in a Muslim household. My family moved around, we lived in Saudi Arabia, we lived in Ethiopia, and then we moved to Kenya. That's where I went to. Part of my elementary school and high school was in Nairobi, Kenya. That's where I learned to speak English. And during my teen periods, this time that I'm in Kenya, which is the 1980s, it's when I learn English and I'm reading books in English, published in the United States and mostly in the UK. But also in the mid-80s, it's when I get attracted to radical Islam brought to us by the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1989, I took part in a book burning of Salman Rushdie's. So that just gives you kind of how complex my background is. So on the one hand, we were dancing to songs by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie. And then on the other hand, I was wearing the full-on burqa and preaching to Christian classmates that they should abandon their religion and come to ours. But fast forward, in 1992, my father, who had been away in the 1980s, comes back from Ethiopia. My father was active in politics, and this is in Somali politics. And so he was in exile, and he had exiled himself to Ethiopia, not with us. And in 1992, when he comes back, I'm 22 years old, and he decides at that point that it's time for his daughters to get married, and there's a man there from Canada looking for a wife, and my father and he decide that I'm the right person for him. And I don't agree with that, but I have no way of getting away from it while in Kenya. And luckily for me, this man was a citizen of Canada, so he had to go back. I wasn't required to live with him immediately. We had to go through that whole immigration process, which was even then incredibly difficult. And a relative from Germany offers my father and my new husband that if I was sent to Germany, then it would be easier for him, for my uncle, to help us prepare my immigration paperwork from Germany to Canada. And my father sends me off to Germany, and I'm there for less than a week, and then I take the train to the Netherlands and I ask for asylum. And they grant it to me within 4 weeks of my application. And from then on, I have, it's a difficult, I make it sound a little easier and more romantic, but it became easier for me. I found myself in a context where I could say, I don't want to live with this man, and I don't want to repeat the life, the difficult life that my mother had. And then I take off. And it's in the Netherlands that I learned the Dutch language. I also get acquainted with liberalism, the way most Dutch people view liberalism. And I would say initially it wasn't a philosophy, it was just really a lived, practiced experience. Then in 1995, I enrolled at the University of Leiden, and I study political science. And that's where I get acquainted with ideologies, the different sets of ideologies. I was very fascinated by political theory. And the different liberalisms, classical liberalism versus neoliberalism versus the laissez-faire type of liberalism, and then the branching out into social democracy and socialism, and then initially, conservatism, and then, Edmund Burke and the Whigs of the UK, what's now the UK. And how that's actually also part of classical liberalism. The history of the Enlightenment, very, very fascinating. And this is from between 1985 to 1999. I graduated in the year 2000 in September.
I want to have you pause there. We'll come on to some of your later work and your later career, but it's fascinating to hear the way in which you experienced illiberalism, and then you experience liberalism as practices before coming to the intellectual foundation. So it wasn't so, would it be fair to say that your commitment to liberalism was first of all a practical one? Actually, if you think about the history of Holland, of course, has always been as a refuge for free thinkers. But yeah. You lived liberalism before you learned liberalism, by the sounds of it.
Absolutely. And I lived authoritarianism and illiberalism before I understood their intellectual underpinnings, whether it was theocratic or socialist / communist. I mean, a lot of people now wonder why I am so virulently anti-woke. And that's because I really understand exactly where that sort of thinking can lead to, what sorts of practices it can lead to.
Yes, any kind of ideological conformity ended up being something that you're sort of allergic. It's sort of it's almost a physical allergy before it's an intellectual opposition. It seems to me, much of your writing and speaking, it has that visceral sense to it because it's been lived for you. Yes,
absolutely. And in fact, I say to young students who grew up in liberal societies who are not familiar with illiberalism in any sort of way, that perhaps before you campaign for some of these changes based on postmodernist theories or theocracies, or before you just give away, people like Timothy Garton Ash, even not a young person, but before you entertain these thoughts, just go and spend some time in the countries where these principles apply. And I think experience in some ways is really the best teacher ever.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about some of the great liberals of the 20th century. I'm thinking about people like Karl Popper and Isaiah Berlin, having had direct experience, yes. And even I guess people like Václav Havel in some way, in a different way, a direct experience of authoritarianism, either directly or indirectly. I actually just had Ron Daniels on my podcast, who runs Johns Hopkins, and his liberalism is influenced by the fact that his parents fled from the Holocaust, and to Canada, where they were one of the few Jewish families that made it through to Canada. But one last personal question, and this speaks a bit to the issue about Islam, which we're going to come on to, and how that interacts with immigration, which you cover in your latest book. But when did you described yourself as a zealous Muslim, burning books and so on, and then a few years later you're not that. Was there a loss of faith? Was there a moment? Was there a crisis of faith? Was there a moment when it all fell away? Was there a conversion? What's the journey from being a true believer, by the sounds of it, to being
I think the journey's always been this dissatisfaction, and this has been continuous in my life, and I think in most people's lives when they commit to the loyalty. So with me, it begins with the loyalty of the clan. I come from a tribal society, and it's all based on the bloodline. You know, you're just loyal to your cousins and your relatives and what they want, and in exchange for that, you're protected. And so there was watching my mother when my father went away, we were provided for at a minimum by our clanmates. But we led a very difficult life and in poverty, and my mother was in constant misery. And I remember feeling terrible for her and being dissatisfied with the way the clan system works. And then at that point, you're seeking something else. And so when these members of the Muslim Brotherhood people come and they say there's something that transcends clan and family and bloodline, and it's God, and it's our religion, that's fascinating and it's attractive. And it seems to answer all the moral questions in a very simple way. There's right, there's wrong, there's in, there's out. And here's a list of things that you may do and things that you may not do. You have to abstain and refrain from. And in the beginning, it gives you clarity. It gives you a sense of purpose. But the dissatisfaction continues because even those of us who adopted this, we are now with God or God's people, we still have to face the reality of the basics of food and shelter and safety, and what is the purpose? How long am I going to live, and what's the purpose of my life? And I think that sense of not being satisfied with the answers I was getting, and in particular the fact that I wasn't allowed to even ask these questions, I think that continued. That was that nagging feeling and thinking in my mind, and I think that led me to then it wasn't a moment of, oh, now I see the light. It's never been like that with me, but I think it was a drifting off, a drifting away from faith without giving it up, without saying, oh, I don't believe anymore. So this is late 1980s, and then this marriage comes that my father's conducting, and by then I can actually see my future, because I think if I go with this man and I do the right thing, I'm going to live just like my mother. I'll be miserable, I'll have no control over my life. I have no clue whether this man is going to stay there to protect me or not. My father didn't. And in any case, I have nothing in common with him. And I think by then, having read so many books of the infidel and watched so many movies of the infidel, having been exposed to Western culture, I was able to think maybe there's something else out there other than that light bulb going off.
So again, that's interesting, because the sort of journey from this sense of kin and clan, the tribal society, which you describe very well in your writing, through to the search to escape from that through some universalizing religion, and then realizing that in itself is insufficiently narrow, and so then moving to I guess an embrace of the inherent and inescapable messiness and complexity and pluralism and unending descent of a modern liberal society. So you opted for the messiness and difficulty and exchange and friction of liberalism, as opposed to either the sort of closed world of the tribe or the simple world of the religion. Is that a fair summary of your journey?
I think it's a fair summary, and I think it's a fair summary from after I graduate from the University of Leiden, where I then am able to connect the practical experience with the intellectual underpinnings when the theoretical framework emerges, and I understand, so these are the ideas that shape the world. But initially, in the first sort of 5 years, maybe 7 years, when I arrive in the Netherlands, I think it's the fascination of just how different the Netherlands was as a place. We asked for asylum. There are all these rules and procedures that they actually honor, and we are sheltered, we are given food, and I'm constantly asking myself, they're being so generous to us, outsiders, coming in and saying, can we be a part of your society? But that generosity wasn't explained on tribal ground, it wasn't explained on theological grounds. And so I kept asking them, then why are you doing it? You're just feeding strangers and sheltering them and giving them medical care and free education. And they would just keep going back to their constitution and their way of life. And they say, well, our government signed a treaty with other nations, but why did they do that? And so through that process, I got myself into understanding, into figuring out, okay, so this is how it works. And then, yes, I got to a point, this is 9/11, 2001, when maybe the big bang of the 21st century. I think the 21st century started with that incident. I think that's when I sort of was made to actually think about it and ask myself, so where does my loyalty lie? Because I was my Somali family members were saying, you're criticizing our religion and you're bringing shame upon us by exposing, and then I wasn't just exposing it, I was condemning it too, condemning the way women are treated and condemning the way our societies are disorganized and chaotic. And so I had to then choose, or was forced to choose, and that was really after, I'm very thankful for those 5 years in the University of Leiden, where I was taught how to think, and to think critically, and to think as an independent individual. And that led me then to say, if I were to compare all of these different ideas and frameworks for life, I prefer liberalism to them all, with all its shortcomings. And that's the great thing about liberalism, is that you can, the shortcomings are transparent.
Yeah, the shortcomings are almost sort of baked in, aren't they? The falsifiability and so on. It's like Churchill's quote about democracy. It's the worst of all the systems except all the others. And then just your commitment to free speech and to criticism and to sort of liberal dialogue. And I know you've written a little bit about John Stuart Mill, who's my subject. You do this really nice conversation in one of your books between the Prophet Muhammad and Mill. So maybe we'll come back a bit to Mill. But you then yourself, as a result of your outspokenness, even outspokenness sounds pejorative, as a result of your speaking out on these issues, you yourself became the target and therefore security concerns. And so I'd just like to talk a little bit about that experience, because you talked about, you became the sort of Salman Rushdie of your day in a way. And it's in stark contrast to what's currently called cancel culture in the US. In the US, being cancelled means someone says something nasty to you and maybe you lose your lucrative writing gig at the New York Times or something. But cancel culture means something very different to you and has done from the beginning, right?
And there are similarities between the cancel culture unfolding now in the US and the culture that tried to cancel my life. And I think that's what you're getting at is...
Yes.
My father had a conversation with me, this is back in 2002, where he said that there were Somali men calling him from the Netherlands, from Sweden, and I think from the UK, and he was in London at the time, and who were saying to him, if you don't stop her, we are going to stop her. And so he was asking me on this phone call to recant, to seek redemption and go back to the fold of the faithful as a Muslim, and just shut up, because if I didn't go silent, then I was going to risk my life. And I ignored him. But I understood why. I had done so many things. So I blasphemed in Islam by saying that I didn't believe in God myself, and I didn't mean to do it as openly, but I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer asked me very directly, so you say all of these things, you say Islam is backward, you say it treats women, but you say all of these things. Does it mean you believe? And I hesitated, and then just said no, not understanding that this is national radio and it carries. And that, to leave the faith, to leave Islam, is to invite punishment by death. And that punishment doesn't have to be carried out by a government. It can be carried out by any individual who feels a sense of responsibility towards Islam. And so that's the cancel culture that's baked into Islamic theology. You leave the faith, you risk death. And not only did I leave the faith, and then I was also condemning so many tenets of the faith that were used, the fact that religion is not separate from politics, the treatment of women, the concept of jihad, and then this closed-mindedness that there was no place for innovation within Islamic philosophy. And all of these things were inviting death, basically, and threats, and also a life of condemnation. And on top of that, with everything that came out, every time I gave an interview or wrote a piece or said something like that in public, I was bringing shame upon my family, not just the immediate family, father, mother, and siblings, but the extended family. And to a point, even a lot of Somalis were saying, you're so selfish, you don't understand, you're doing this to us. And so that's for you, in a nutshell, why freedom of speech and freedom of conscience doesn't work in the tribal and theological philosophical frameworks.
Well, I guess the distinction that I was alluding to is one that just came out in what you were saying. And you're very involved in the debates in the US around free speech, and you've mentioned kind of woke culture and so on. But the difference between someone who has death threats, credible death threats, given that some of your collaborators have actually lost their lives, who has to think about their own security, and who has to bring shame and possibly even danger to their own families, that's a very different kind of courage to the kind of courage that people say they have to have here to write an opinion piece that some of their colleagues don't like. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I sometimes find the tendency among some people in the US to say, "Oh, you're so brave," So you write a book that that Amazon doesn't like, and then you go on Sam Harris or kind of whatever, and people congratulate you for how brave you are, and then you get a Substack and start making lots of money, and so in some ways, I sort of think the difference is instructive, because there's a bit of a tendency to draw a false analogy, I would say, between the kinds of cultures where speaking out puts you at risk, where you are having to leave your family behind, and the ones where it's sort of socially uncomfortable. And I don't know, you said there are some similarities. I'm now drawing a very sharp distinction, and I'm being perhaps a bit unfair, and I'm accusing some of the people in the US of being whiners by comparison to what others have faced. But I had Mustafa Akyol on a while ago too, and whilst he hasn't faced anything like you, he did get thrown in jail in Indonesia, and his family's in Turkey, and so it's on the spectrum. It's nothing like what you've experienced, but it's still very different to what, say, I might face by going on a podcast and saying something unfortunate.
I think also the contexts are different. So being a Muslim and growing up within a Muslim household and a Muslim society, and knowing that physical punishment, capital punishment, is very, very common, the threshold towards violence is much, much lower than in liberal societies. But I really want us to be very careful to not take all of this for granted and think, oh, we just couldn't fall back into that tribal way of life. I mean, living in America, I don't know where you are right now, but in America, just in the last year, we've seen a lot of social unrest and a lot of violence. And I think that if you, I don't know, it reminds me of Thomas Hobbes. It's so with me coming away from that Hobbesian background, and with immigration, we brought it with us. Just because we crossed the border, it didn't, liberalism didn't just rub off on us. I understand the distinction that you are trying to make, where you say, threats against your life are much more profound than the fear of losing your job or the fear of losing your reputation. But within a peaceful liberal society, such things as losing your job, losing your reputation, and then also being condemned with, if I just now call you a white supremacist and a racist, and you can't defend yourself against it, I think those things are just as frightening in a different way. It's not a life and death matter, but to some, it is so profound that they've actually considered, I'm talking about some of the people in the United States, some professors have considered suicide. And I know of one story at least of a person who has done that. So the level of shaming achieves, and the ostracization achieves pretty much the same goal in some ways as those who threaten you, who are wielding knives and guns and bombs and using cars and anything that they can find as tools to kill. The similarities are where there is an abandonment of reason and persuasion by means of reason. Either you are with these people and I'll use the New York Times and Barry Weiss as an example. I'm a great admirer of Barry Weiss, and I find her courageous. So she's just a young person who is, she has thrown herself at her journalistic career, and she's exceptionally good at it. She's with this flagship paper, and she has a lot of her colleagues abusing her. Now, this is not physical abuse. They're not beating her up. They haven't thrown her in jail. They can't do that. But they're abusing her mentally and psychologically because of the positions she holds, say, on the existence of Israel. And the senior people, the leaders in charge, are so frightened of the bullies within the New York Times that behind closed doors they would say to Barry, "Oh, you are so brave, oh, we stand with you," but they don't do anything about it. So for her to get out and go to Substack and just make this fantastic recovery, it's a pathway that I admire. And I think this is one of the advantages that we have in a society like America, where if all else fails, you can lean on the free markets to say to the New York Times, screw you, and Substack comes along, and I think that's a great development.
Yes, or podcasts. So the advantage of plural societies is the advantage of plural societies is that they create that plurality. I'm thinking of Andrew Sullivan as well as another example. So you get So I was only partly joking when I said getting cancelled is a good career move for lots of people because they don't, you can. But what I worry about, and I know that you've been involved in some of these debates about free speech and higher education, and we don't need to get into any of the details here, but I think what worries me is the segmentation less than the silencing. So it feels to me as if, like, I can go and I can listen to Andrew Sullivan, I can read Barry Weiss, I can listen to your podcast, Christina Hoff Sommers, who I know you've had on. I read her stuff. It's not like it isn't there. It's more that it's separated. It's more that, like, if you want to read one kind of sort of groupthink, you go to the New York Times editorial page. If you want to read another one, you go somewhere else. And so it's more this sense of having to pick sides that seems to me to be the problem, because then you don't get the dialogue, you don't get the kind of exchange.
But the thing is, I think the problem is different. I think it is, if you, I keep using the term liberal societies, and you already mentioned pluralism. I think that we got used to a situation where what happened to me with Muslims saying, oh, somebody doesn't deserve to live or hold her job or be in polite society because she blasphemed, was seen as very strange in the early 2000s, or even with Salman Rushdie. A lot of the people in the West were just aghast. They had no clue why the head of state of Iran was bothered about a novelist in the UK, probably condemning him for a book he hadn't even read. But the situation today is different. The plural society where we took it for granted, you can say, in fact, we lived by that, and most of us still do, where you think, why can't we just have all of these different voices? And the audience gets to evaluate what it is that they're being persuaded to agree to, and freely agree to it or freely disagree with it, and we move on. I think that's what we are losing, and what the woke are bringing into the into our schools and universities and areas of discourse is to say there's only one true way of evaluating justice and equality and freedom, and it's our way or no other way. And that's what's different. So when I first came in 2000, and it wasn't the first time, I settled in the United States in 2006, I was working at the American Enterprise Institute, and we were fraternizing with the Brookings Institution. I was going to events organized by Cato. There were Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals in the American sense, which is probably closer to social democrats. Perhaps that's what you would think of them in the Netherlands. But these conversations were taken for granted, and in many ways they were very friendly. I remember very polite. I would go to parties where Christopher Hitchens would rub shoulders with people he had called all sorts of terrible names when they were in office. Dick Cheney would be there, and Christopher Hitchens would be there, and it was a wonderful thing, I have to say, because that's how it's supposed to be, and I think we sort of took that for granted, and that's no longer possible. I think it is no longer possible because people have started to say, I think they've been cowed, and now we go back to cowardice. They've been frightened off by the woke, by the cancel culture, by the condemnations. You're not going to these places now in good faith. You're worried that somebody is going to, take something you said out of context, and then the process, the social media pile-on and cancellation begins.
Yes, it's interesting. I would say, as I work at Brookings, I think there is actually think tank land in some ways. I think is still in better shape than academia. We do work a lot across those lines, and it may be partly because it's closer to the practicality. Ironically, I think that when you're trying to actually get something done, something quite dull perhaps, like reforming the EITC or whatever, then actually you do need to work with, I have a lot of friends at AEI, with the people at AEI, and try and get bipartisan agreement for it. Whereas in the academy, when it's just intellectual, when it's supposed to be that exchange of ideas, in some ways because you're not trying to make policy, you're just positioning yourself intellectually. It's all about the intellectual position.
I think it's worse. I think there is actually an emerging ideology that wasn't seen in academia, and everybody thought it's not my problem. I mean, it's only concentrated in the gender studies department or in the black studies department. It is something that doesn't touch me. I don't care. I remember when I was at Harvard, this is in 2012, 13, 14, I would see whiffs of this thing, and I just thought that just sounds so ridiculous. And exactly like the way we started the conversation, because the radical Islamists were trying to cancel me on punishment of death, when a bunch of undergraduates come making demands, I would think, oh, come on, just give them a big cookie and a glass of milk and send them back to the classroom. And that tells me how we all underestimated it. And now in 2021, I think we're actually facing an ideology, modern, homemade, that is potent and that is just capable of dividing society into tribes and factions, and where fear reigns, where people are literally afraid of what comes out of their mouths.
Yeah, I think this idea of self-censorship, which I think is actually a different kind of censorship, of course, and is sometimes understated. It wasn't in Mill, of course. He talked a lot about the tyranny of custom and how that enslaves the soul itself and so on. He actually was more worried about the censorship that you, as a result of that tyranny, than he was about government censorship. And I think that's what you're talking about here, is this sense of people just silencing themselves or censoring. And actually the thing that troubles me the most in this debate is when I hear people saying, I'm just not going to do any work in that area anymore. I'm just going to work somewhere else. And it's not that they're not going to say anything good or bad. They're just not going to say anything. And that's because of a rational calculation of cost benefit, is that the cost of getting it wrong to your reputation is pretty high and the benefits are pretty low. So why work on the issue? I'll give you an example of a colleague who works on labour market issues, and he's a white academic at a elite university, and he used to do a lot of work on race, and he's increasingly decided just not to work on race and to work on other issues instead. And it's not that there aren't people working on race in the labour market, so I'll just leave that. But the reason he does that is because it's just, if you he feels like if he puts a foot wrong, it could destroy his whole reputation. So it's almost like what we're not doing and what we're not saying becomes more of a problem.
Absolutely, and then if you take this to its logical conclusion, that is an erosion of this whole process of critical thinking, which is how we became so advanced as societies, was to pursue any of these questions and see where they lead, and bring all the different perspectives that you can bring into to get to that process of verifying and falsifying. You see what holds up and what doesn't hold up, but now you just have an ever narrowing list of areas that you may study and areas that you have to stay out and away from. The critical race theory people constantly racialize everything, and they've made us aware, that's a compliment to them, that there is actually an injustice where black people in this country are not represented in the labor market, in top and all sorts of positions of prominence, that they make a fraction of what their white countrymates make. So there is, in my view, in fact, a pressing need to look into it and not chase researchers away from trying to figure out why that is and what are all the factors that lead or have led to that outcome and how can we change it. But the critical race theories will not allow any other way of looking at the problem other than the way they see it. And the way they see it is divisive and it's destructive. And that's, in my view, divisive and destructive, by saying we have to bring down the structures and begin with a clean slate, and every white person is a racist and an oppressor, and we have to sort of get into this crazy redistribution matrix that they have in their heads. That has consequences, and I think the consequences are not so great. And that is where to go back to self-censorship, I think self-censorship is a way of surrendering the platforms that we have, the market of ideas, to a tyrannical few. It's not a large number of people we're talking about. We're talking about a very small number of people, very loud and very aggressive and shameless. But we are surrendering our institutions to them. And it's not just the institutions of higher learning. It's now in elementary schools and high schools. It's in the media. They've come for, the institutions that uphold the law, the rule of law, so that we can have conversations without violence. They are literally infiltrating and getting into and poisoning every institution with this identity politics. And we are repaying them with self-censorship. Self-censorship is, to me, it's not just a matter of cowardice, it's a matter of surrender.
It's interesting to reframe this as these cultures are created by many, many, many small acts of courage and many, many small acts of cowardice, on the other hand, rather than these big heroic ones. So it's easy to see a story like yours as a kind of heroic individual standing up in a very, very prominent and courageous way. But I think what we're circling around here is the idea that it's actually the accumulation of millions of moments of deciding whether to hold your tongue or say what you really think. I mean, actually, this idea of truthfulness that I learned from Bernard Williams is very helpful to me here, which is that actually truthfulness is just trying to be accurate and trying to be sincere.
Yes.
And that value of truthfulness being the thing that I think lies at the heart of the discourse that you're talking about. I want to talk a bit more about Islam now, if that's okay. Just because on the one hand, you're one of these people that's sort of fighting, on 8 different fronts at once. And I was thinking a bit about your critique of Islam, including in your most recent book, Pray, but more generally, which I think is similar in the sense that it predetermines the arena within which you're allowed to think.
Yes.
So you have to think, you have to believe in God. So this idea of the arena is set by a certain ideology is a similarity, I think, between your criticism of what you call woke culture here and Islam. And you think it's constitutive of Islam and it has implications for how we think about immigration, which I'll turn to in just a second. But I'm going to quote you. You said this in 2015. You're quoted as saying, the problem isn't just a few rotten apples in the Islamic community, but the entire basket. And your criticism of Islam is that its problems are constitutive of the religion itself because of the way it teaches, because of the way it operates. And so you can't do what Mustafa Akyol said, which is, there's a liberal version of Islam, or maybe you think there is a liberal version of Islam available, but you think that the illiberalism is baked in from the very ground of Islamic theology.
There are liberal Muslims, and I think it's very, very important conceptually to separate Islam as a set of ideas from the people who adhere to Islam. So the adherents from the philosophy. And if you look at the adherents, there's a great deal of diversity. I would say the large majority are in fact indifferent and they just want to worship and go about the business and live their lives and are not sitting around philosophizing about what did Muhammad say when and how, and they don't have the time and the luxury to do that. But there are subsets within Islam, and still a minority, and so Mustafa has a point there. A minority, again, very loud, very aggressive, who are saying, we need to adhere to the philosophy of Muhammad, uncensored and unmodernized, and you have no right to innovate it because you are neither a prophet of God nor are you God. And to think about innovation is to put yourself in the shoes of God or Muhammad, and that is the biggest blasphemy ever. And that's one minority. I call them Medina Muslims. I call them Medina Muslims because when Muhammad, the prophet, the founder of Islam, went to Medina, that is when he transitioned from a process of trying to persuade people to come to his religion when he was in Mecca. And when he comes to Medina, he starts to use force, and it pays off. And it pays off wildly that they become an empire. And so you can't, in a way, you can see why the minority who want to adhere, that if they're seeking glory, that's the way to go, because that's the example that Muhammad set. The large majority are what I would just describe as Mecca Muslims, those who came or who think that they came, or who were born into Islam, but who think that they came to Islam through persuasion and not through force. And then there's a small minority, I think Mustafa Akyol is one of them, who are willing and have the courage to say, we need to modernize this philosophy. So the real conversation then is between the Medina Muslims, those who are saying, let's adhere to Islamic beliefs in pure form, and those who are saying, let's modernize. In that debate, if you were a jury or a judge and you were to review the material, you are going to see that it is baked into it. The Prophet Muhammad said no innovation. He used force to spread the religion. It's called jihad, holy war. And even after Muhammad died, there were a number of people constantly who were trying to adapt, not just in life, in practical life, but the philosophical framework. They were trying to adapt it to the reality of the day. And let me call them innovators or reformers or whatever you want to call them, modifiers. They were the ones who always got into trouble. They were always exiled or killed, and some of their material is still available. It's been preserved. But that the impulse to change things and to innovate was always there in Islam. So I have to say, Mustafa Akyol and the others who want to liberalize, they have a point and they have a tradition to build on. But they can't build on that without actually having a dialogue, a philosophical dialogue with the founder of Islam himself. And to do that, you have to go through the accusations of blasphemy, and you have to go through the accusations of being called a heretic and being cancelled. And in the day and age of the internet, I think it's really quite potent, because in 2001, when I first started out speaking and first realizing that there was a firewall around the Islamic belief system, I was very pessimistic and thought the only way out for good Muslims is really to get out of the religion like I have done, because if you stay within, you're going to accomplish nothing. And now, fast forward in 2001, after having seen so many people accomplish a lot within the framework of the religion, I'm much more optimistic. But it does pay to go through the pain of asking questions.
Yes, and that's what people like Mustafa are doing. But it sounds as if you do think it's possible to create a new space within which to reform Islam, but it requires changing the rules of the game in the way that you just described. And so there's a the Akyol. I mean, Mustafa thinks we have to go back a long way, right? He doesn't think this is it's not a quick fix here. Mm-hmm. And it requires a shift in the very theology with which you approach things like the hadiths,
yes,
and the Prophet Muhammad and so on. But he thinks that could be done, that there is an alternative path that Islam could have taken. It went the wrong way sort of 400 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got to go back at least 400 years. But it sounds like you think that's at least
the wrong way
plausible.
1400 years ago.
Well, that's the difference between you and Mustafa, maybe, right? So that's the difference.
Yeah.
There you go. It's like, because if you took it to its extreme, right? If you take was it 400 years ago or 1400 years ago? It certainly wasn't 4 or 40 years ago,
yeah.
Right? That does lead to some different implications in terms of what the long-run goal here is.
Yeah.
So what someone like Mustafa would say is the long-run goal here is to completely reground Islamic theology in a way that makes it compatible with modern liberalism. Another view is that's an impossible task just to do that. And so in the end, the only thing we can do is just try to get rid of Islam. Hope that we will end up in a world one day where there is no Islam, because it's irredeemable in that sense.
I think that's fanciful, and that's just not going to happen. But there's a pragmatic way of looking at things and saying there are people right now, I mean, leaders of nations. Take the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the leader of the UAE, the president of Egypt. They're exploring pragmatic ways of modernizing their nations. And Saudi Arabia is a very interesting case, because that's where the Hijaz is, where Mecca and Medina are, 1/5 of humanity, when they pray, they face Mecca. It's got all this symbolic power. It's the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. That's where he's buried. And so and it's also Sunni Islam. So the Sunnis are about 85% of Muslims. So what happens in Saudi Arabia is very, very interesting for this change that we are all longing for. And if the Saudis do take that pragmatic step, very pragmatic, not theological, they're not looking into the philosophical framework, but they want to modernize their society away from oil and, say, join the wider economy, that forces them to review their school systems. It forces them to educate their women. It forces them to bring science into the classroom, because they're fascinated with technology. And once you bring science into the classroom and science into society, you are opening the gates wide for asking questions and critical thinking and criticizing, because things either fail or they succeed. And with that, he then has to take these practical measures of saying, okay, I'm going to emasculate the morality police. They're just not going to be, he just abolished them. That's pragmatism. That's a process that I think then people like Mustafa who want to give this a theological justification, they can do it. And I think ultimately it's this collaboration, consciously or unconsciously, wittingly or unwittingly, that is going to open a new path for what could be a new Islam. A new, and you know, ultimately, because every time you let's say the morality police, you say, but what would the Prophet Muhammad say? Well, at some point you will have to give an answer to that.
Right, and every
they have
their police. Yeah, well, Mustafa was arrested. He was arrested by the morality police, so he's got some experience of this.
Yeah.
Where this I think becomes quite real in terms of policy is, let's talk a bit about your most recent book, Pray, where you, and this is a good example of, you know, being pretty fearless in terms of your thinking, where you describe the rise in crime in certain European countries, you know, especially places like Germany.
Crime against women.
Crime against women especially. Yeah. And you show that is related to the rise in Muslim immigration, and therefore make the argument that it's because Muslim men in particular come to Western European, so they're immigrants from predominantly Muslim, traditionally Muslim countries, and bring with them an attitude towards women and a view about women and about violence, which then plays out in higher levels of violent crime against women. And you ask Western feminists why this isn't kind of more of an issue. And so this is, you said earlier, I think that liberalism doesn't just rub off on you. Yeah. And this is, and I think you present some pretty good evidence where you've been able to find it, that there is at least some connection there. But have I described the basic thesis correctly? You have. You've described it correctly, and I think that it's when I just want to say a little bit more about. They come from traditionally Muslim countries, but they also come from tribal societies, and so their attitudes towards women are shaped by these two forces. And there's a third force, which is what they perceive Western culture to be, and as white women to be, because their perception of, and there's one Egyptian whom I quote in the book, who tells me that it is, yes, it's the tribal and it's traditionally Islamic, but it's also this idea that they get over the internet and cinema, television, and so on, that the white woman can only be seen through the lens that they see of Hollywood and pornography, and then a third set of women who come to the NGOs, work in NGOs, and some of these women are looking for lovers or they're looking for husbands, and they come with these preconceived notions about what it is that they think the white woman wants, and that is a toxic mix. And then those attitudes then actually play out, and that's the subject of the book. And the other part of the book is then when these crimes against women occur. So first we saw crimes against women, immigrant women being subjected to those attitudes from home, being forced into marriage, female genital mutilation, honor violence. And these women were not protected. The immigrant women were not protected. The attitude of feminists and the general public was, you know, they would try a few times and then say, well, it's a difficult problem. It's just their problem, and they'll emerge out of it. So they ignored the suffering of the immigrant women, and the scale of immigration from these countries got ever bigger, and it will get bigger only. And now it's spilling over to the public space where some of these men are attacking all women. And the reaction, the response from those whose responsibility it is to uphold the law has been disappointing, and the feminists have been really quiet and incurious. Because of the commitment to cultural sensitivity and so on that you talk about. But so if you just treat this as an empirical question for a moment, right? Let's leave aside the implications of these findings, and we'll come to those, because I do think there are some legitimate reasons why people would be concerned, not to overemphasize the data. But when you've gathered data, and I'll just share a couple of data points from your book, which is you show that between 2014 and 2018, the share of non-Germans among those accused suspects in cases of sexual violence rose from 18% to 29%. You show that in 2018, there's about 1,000 rape cases that were reported. More than half of the suspects, it was 55%, were not Austrian citizens. And the book is, you've really tried hard to get data, even when it's hard to get. And so as an empirical matter, those are hard facts to ignore. And it seems to me, just reading it just purely empirically, as if to the extent that you can get the data, the case is supportive of this idea that there's at least a connection there between them. But I guess my question then would be, these are still very small numbers in the aggregate, right? And so the danger then is of what you'd call statistical discrimination. There are lots of different types of groups who are overrepresented within a certain criminal group. Black Americans within the US, for example, for all kinds of reasons. But that doesn't mean that should change the way we treat individuals, and certainly individual Muslims. So, we'll get on maybe to hijab and other things too. But there's an overrepresentation of these immigrant groups within a very small number of these crimes. And so is there reason to be careful not to highlight that disproportion? Is because when it gets out into the public, what people hear is all these Muslim men are raping all these women, and lose the fact that it's a very, very tiny minority. And you end up with this statistical discrimination where you look at Muslim men differently because a tiny minority, albeit a slightly higher proportional minority, are engaged in these crimes.
So a couple of things on that, and I think I say it in the book. I think that I agree with you. It's relatively small at the moment. It was smaller 10 years ago and even smaller 20 years ago, but the buzz was there that things were different and that men from largely Muslim countries behaved differently towards women, whether it was their women or other women. And the reason why I wrote this book is I think that you should address these problems while they're relatively small, because you don't get yourself into a place where the problems become too big to solve, that you get to, and I've seen this in other crime areas where you say, well, let's just legalize it. So to me, it's unthinkable and unacceptable for us to say, let's just stop criminalizing some, like sexual harassment or certain types of violence against women. We don't have the resources for it. It's just too big. So address the problem while it is relatively small. On the statistical discrimination, where you think, and this is exactly, getting the empirical data was like pulling teeth. These governments just don't want to do it exactly because of what you say. There's this fear that if you release this information to the general public, there's going to be, the attitudes towards immigrants will be very, very negative. I think the opposite is actually true. Because in a democratic society, when your leaders lie to you and tell you what you've just experienced is really very small, insignificant, or non-existent, that's when you start to take hatred, not only towards the leaders who are telling you these things, but also towards immigrants. And if you look at today's Europe, it's very different from the Europe that I came to in 1992. In 1992, there was this naive opening of, and I'm talking about in general, there were minorities who rejected immigrants, but the general public was welcoming and felt a sense of empathy and talked incredibly about their own experience with the Second World War and with tyranny and so on. So they were very welcoming of people who were coming from countries that had fallen apart, like mine in Somalia. Today, the attitude has changed dramatically. Everywhere you go, in Germany, in France, in Sweden, in all of these countries, you have very entrenched far-right or populist parties who have only one issue, immigration and Islam. And in my view, the only way to defeat them and to blunt their advancement is to address these issues honestly. And that's the purpose of the book. So I think that the fear that if we talk about these things openly, or if we take the voters seriously, then the far right will prevail. That it's empirically wrong. The more we sweep these things under the rug, the more powerful the far right get.
I think yes. I think it's an interesting broader point too, is because someone will get under the rug.
Yeah.
You can't sweep it there forever, and I think it's in some ways it loops back to where we were a moment ago talking about this, about truthfulness and accuracy, which is if people start to lose faith in public institutions, you can think about actually public health institutions in the light of COVID or etc. If you start to think that they're not just sharing the data faithfully anymore, then you start to doubt it, and someone will pick it up. And you say this in the book. You said it will get weaponized by the far right, and you have a great quote which I can't found now, but I'm using it somewhere else from I think a Dutch Jewish lawyer is my memory of it, saying something like, if responsible parties don't deal with real issues, irresponsible parties will. That's an axiom of history. I'm
yes.
paraphrasing.
Yes, absolutely true. And also a third thing that you said it yourself, which was treat everyone else. You should treat immigrants the way you treat everyone else. That's precisely what I believe. When there is sexual violence committed by a native in those countries, they are ostracized out of their communities, they're stigmatized. I know that the legal framework, the legal system in Europe is very lenient compared to the one in Europe, but everything is thrown at them. And that's precisely what I'm asking for. Treat the immigrant perpetrators in exactly the same way as you would treat the native perpetrators. Stop using the cultural excuses.
And you make the point, actually, that culture is used in different ways. Sometimes you're not allowed to use culture, and sometimes you are. And I was thinking, even within the US, I'm spending a lot of time in the southern US right now, and the idea of the honor culture among certain communities in the southern US is very strong.
Yes.
I know this guy whose sister's boyfriend was beating her up, and so he went and broke both his legs and ended up going to prison as a result, and doesn't regret it at all, because there's a kind of honor culture thing. And so people would say quite happily, well, it's a very different culture in, say, in white working class Appalachia, but they'd be very reluctant to say there's a different culture in certain Islamic societies. Well, I know I need to let you go.
Yes.
Kept you a little bit longer
I think
than I
they've
like.
stopped harassing me now. They're harassing you.
No, because I know you've got to jump off to another call.
I keep getting so many text messages. You need to come. You need to come. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if the pinging came through to our audience, but they will know that you're not making it up. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a lot of these issues, but in terms of sort of continuing to call it as you see it and engaging in these debates, and also thank you for engaging with me in the areas we disagree as much as the ones where we do. I think that's the whole purpose of this exercise. Right? That's the whole point. That's the whole point. So with that, I wish you well, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And good luck. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.